Cowboy Bebop is often seen as one of the best anime out there. I mean, it is an action show about bounty hunters in space. It has great animation, especially for its time, an amazing soundtrack. Bebop is an example of a show that can almost be considered objectively good in terms of production elements. This leads me to a question about the show. That question is, if Cowboy Bebop is so great, then why don't I enjoy it? Of course, me not liking the show doesn't mean that I think the show is bad. And in this video, I am in no way trying to make the claim that Cowboy Bebop is a bad show. Instead, the question I am asking is, why don't I like this show? What is it specifically about Cowboy Bebop that I don't like? Let's start trying to answer this question from the very beginning. What is it about any piece of media that people like? Now, this is not really a question that can be definitively answered. People can enjoy media for vastly different reasons. A relatively common example of this is the themes versus narrative debate. To explain this, I'll use a YouTuber by the name of That Anime Snob as an example. More specifically, I will use his review of the book 1984 as an example. In Snob's video, he spends pretty much the entire video discussing the plot of the book, and as a result, he ends up talking very negatively about the book. And because Snob talked negatively about 1984, a part of his fan base who are fans of the book freaked out without actually logically thinking about why Snob disliked the book. The reason Snob hated 1984 was because the actual plot of the book was absolute garbage. And if I had reviewed the book, I would have been far harsher on the plot than even he was. The reason the book is so popular to this day has nothing to do with the actual plot of the book, and it has completely to do with themes presented in the book. So when someone like Snob, who is someone who prefers narrative over themes in their media, reads the book, of course he's going to dislike it. You see, the portions of Snob's fanbase that got angry at him for giving 1984 a bad review are most certainly people who value themes over narrative. Because of this, they are capable of overlooking the plot in favor of themes, while Snob did the exact opposite. This split in how people view media leads to an immediate difference in what type of media people will enjoy, and on top of it all, this is far from the only split in how people view media. In the end, because there is such variation in why people might enjoy any piece of media, we need to ask a more specific question, and ask why would an individual like a specific piece of media. And because the topic we are discussing is Cowboy Bebop, we can specify the question even more. This leaves us with the question of, what does a fan of Cowboy Bebop like about the show? This is a question we might actually be able to get an answer to. In order to answer this question, we need to ask fans of Cowboy Bebop what is it specifically they like about the show. For the purposes of this video, I have done this by posing the question across multiple different platforms. The following is a list of the most common reasons that I was given when I asked people why they liked the show. This list is in no particular order. Reason number 1 that I was given was the music. People claim that the soundtrack of the show greatly increased their enjoyment of the show. Reason number 2 that I was given was the characters. Fans of the show seemed to really enjoy how the characters developed and seeing their backstories. Reason number 3 was the setting. The fans I asked loved the sci-fi setting, which involved humans colonizing the solar system. Reason number 4 was the episodic nature of the show. Many of the fans I asked would mention how much they enjoyed how they can watch almost any episode without worrying about what happened in the previous episode. Reason number 5 is the ending. I'll try and avoid talking about this one because of spoiler concerns, but I will say that it seemed to stick with the people I asked. And lastly, reason number 6 was that it was just cool. This was the most common answer I was given. With these answers given, we have answered the question of what does a Cowboy Bebop fan like about the show. Now we can go back to our original question of why I personally don't enjoy the show. To do this, let's go through each reason a fan likes the show one at a time. This is one I don't have much to say, as I really enjoyed Bebop's soundtrack. Again, this is another one I don't have much to say, as I don't have a problem with the characters. In fact, I don't think there was a single member of the crew that I didn't like. This is the first one I actually have a problem with. I am not a fan of the setting. While I found the concept of the setting to be great, I am a fan of the human colonizing the solar system concept. I found that too much of the setting was left unexplained. The show would briefly mention things like the gate incident which radically altered Earth, but then it would never mention it again. This would leave me constantly annoyed at the setting because it would introduce concept that I liked, but never go anywhere. This just left me with nothing to grab onto. This isn't actually entirely true. The show isn't purely episodic as it has an overarching plot. Although a lot of the episodes are unrelated, the show keeps coming back to the plot in the end. This is a problem for me. The show is trying to have its cake and eat it too. It's trying to be both episodic and story driven at the same time. The problem with this is unless you actually have an episodic episode tied back to the plot in the end, a lot of the plot will just feel overly convenient. So to answer how I feel about the episodic nature, I don't like the way Cowboy Bebop specifically did it. I am not going to mention anything specific here besides saying that I think it was done pretty well. Whether or not I think the show is cool or not is a very broad question. Do I think the show as a whole was cool? Well, the answer is both yes and no. Some parts I thought were cool, while others I didn't. With this show being semi-episodic, each episode is extremely different from the last. That being said, there were some episodes which I did find extremely cool. An example of an episode I thought was really cool was episode 1. And yes, I'm probably the only one in the entire world who thinks that episode 1 in Cowboy Bebop was a great episode. In fact, I'm probably the only one in the entire world who thinks it's the best episode also. There was a cool drug dealer plotline in an incredibly well-made city that was built on an asteroid, and it just felt like a really well-made crime thriller. There was a ton of mise-en-scène in the scenes where you can tell what's going to happen just by paying close attention. It was a really great episode, and if the entire series was like that one episode, it would have been one of my favorite shows ever. But sadly, the rest of the show isn't like that episode. In fact, the plot of the episode is never mentioned again. And again, this would have been fine if the show was actually episodic. But considering how the show ends up having an overarching plot in the end, not tying these episodes into the plot made them feel pointless in the end. This is without even mentioning how easy it would have been to tie these episodes to the main plot, given that it had to do with a crime syndicate. But instead, episode 1 just involved an irrelevant crime syndicate that is never explored or mentioned again. But getting back to the question of what specifically about Cowboy Bebop do I not like, I think we finally have some answers to this question. The parts of Cowboy Bebop I don't like are apparently 1. How vague the setting is, 2. The fact that the show is only semi-episodic, and 3. That I don't think the show as a whole is cool. This is very telling as these 3 things can easily be related to one another. For example, the fact that the show is only semi-episodic could be the reason why the setting is so vague, as each episode needs to introduce and solve a new problem, and this might not even have time to explore the ambitious setting that the show puts forth. The fact that I don't find the show as a whole to be cool could be because of how vague the setting is, as no topic ends up getting explored thoroughly. I think we have found the answer to our question. The answer to why I don't like Cowboy Bebop is because I don't find it cool. Why do I not find it cool? Because the setting is too vague and there's nothing for me to grab onto. Why is the setting so vague? Because the show is in a weird position of only being semi-episodic. But this answer feels unsatisfying to me. Why is it that although these problems hinder my enjoyment, they don't hinder the enjoyment of other people? To try and figure this out, I will compare 2 relatively similar fantasy shows that I have vastly different feelings on. These 2 shows are Konosuba and Re:Zero. Konosuba is a show that I loved watching every minute of, while Re:Zero is a show that would only make me more and more mad the more I watched it. Why is that? Well, Konosuba pretty much fully explains the world in the first few episodes. We know they are in a beginner town, how a bunch of different classes work. We know the vague concept of the Demon King, which is the bad guy of the show. And we know the standard D&D stuff. Sure, we don't know everything, but we know what we need to know in order to understand the world. In Re:Zero, we know almost nothing about the world, and even in the end, I am still left with basic questions about how the world works. This is especially a problem given how the show tries to have a political intrigue plotline, yet never feels the need to explain to us how the political system actually works in this world. This would leave me at the end of every episode with more questions than I had when the episode started, with no answers in sight. In the end, Re:Zero, like many other fantasy stories, became a victim of its own over-ambition. And it isn't like it is impossible to actually write an ambitious fantasy story. I mean, Game of Thrones is a great example of an ambitious fantasy story that actually explains the world as it goes on. You understand how the government works and the political intrigue need to gain power is clear because of it. To use a sci-fi anime example, basically another form of fantasy, Legend of Galactic Heroes is a perfect example of this. Much like Game of Thrones, the show actually explains how the universe actually works. Of course, none of these shows are perfect. There is, after all, no such thing as a perfect piece of media. But they do fix the giant problem I had with Re:Zero. Why did I bring up Re:Zero in a video about Cowboy Bebop, you might ask? That is very simple. I have the same problem with both of them, and they could both be fixed in the same way. They are both shows which try to create a massive world and end up failing in my eyes by not properly developing the world. But as I just said, both these shows have a rather simple fix. That fix would be abandoning their sci-fi and fantasy setting for a more realistic world. I know this might sound crazy to some, but to help me explain what I mean, I'll use a much worse piece of media as an example. Chronexia and the Eight Seals is a fantasy book written by the YouTuber Misty Chronexia. His book is widely seen by everyone who is a fanboy of his channel as terrible. Why is that? Well, the most common reason given by people is that the book is horribly inconsistent. The characters gain powers without any explanation of where they got them from. Characters that were or weren't in the scene show up and disappear when it is convenient to the plot. And in general, the plot and setting don't make much sense. However, there is an easy fix to this book. You see, fantasy is the hardest type of fiction to write. It involves a lot of planning and the creation of a brand new world with its own set of rules that you have to stick to no matter what. Essentially, while writing a fantasy novel, you have to be a god for the world you are writing. And while that can be an extremely rewarding experience, if done right, it can also be an absolute gong show if done badly. This is why it is recommended that new authors don't start with fantasy. If they want to write a fantasy-like story, they should start off with something like a historical fiction setting, with some light fantasy elements, as this allows for a similar setting, with the author needing to create fewer new rules. This is clearly what Misty Chronexia needed to do to fix his book, and to a lesser extent, what both Bebop and ReZero needed to do. The problem with these shows is that they are focused on the micro. They are about a few people, and the setting is just for flavor. In these shows, nothing about the world is directly mentioned unless it is directly affecting the main characters of the show. The settings are only what they are because the authors thought it would be cool. In reality, there is no need to have such elaborate settings when they don't actually add anything to the story. Bebop didn't need to be in space. If it was set in the Wild West, almost nothing in the show would be different. ReZero didn't need the main character to travel to a different dimension. It could have easily taken place in a fictional kingdom in the Middle Ages with light fantasy elements. It didn't need to have elves to discuss racism either, as there's already plenty of that in history to use. While focusing on the micro is fine to some extent, you can't just ignore the macro entirely, especially when the world you are writing is so different from our own. We need to have some level of understanding of how the world works, or there is no point of having that setting in the show. Remember, me criticizing these shows is not the same as me saying they are bad. Nor am I saying that all these shows need to try and be realistic. What I'm saying is that shows should try and use the setting they have chosen to their fullest potential. If you want to be in space, have a reason for it. If you want to be in a fantasy world, have a reason for it. All I am saying is that if you can't justify using these settings, then there is no shame in setting your story in the real world with only minor fantasy elements. I mean, look at a show like Baccano. It is a show set mostly in the 1930s, yet it introduced fantasy elements only as needed. The setting is one of the most important parts of a show, and it's important to pick the right one. One last thing before I go. Remember when I mentioned that 1984 review at the beginning of the video? Just because you like a piece of media doesn't mean it is perfect. You might love a piece of media for one reason, but that doesn't mean someone else can't hate it for a different reason. Admitting the plot of 1984 is bad doesn't get rid of the themes the book presents. Just like admitting that the setting of Bebop is not perfect doesn't invalidate the coolness of the show, or the characters, or the music. This is just two people who happen to watch the same show, yet came out with two different experiences. And without any further ado, that is it for this video. If you'd like to see more, please like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, it is @mattbenz99, and until next time, thanks for watching.